Welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. Today we're going to be talking about kutzil. I built this deck with the challenge to my playgroup. Every single card has to be under $1. I will say since I built this deck, a couple cards have gone up, but I'm not going to change the deck. It's just going to stay how it is because I actually own it in paper. It's still extremely budget and I'm going to share it with you guys today because it actually turned out pretty solid, and it's one of those budget decks where when you're playing against it, every single card kind of makes sense and it doesn't feel exactly like a budget deck. Now it does feel like a lower power deck, but again, not budget. So let's talk about the sponsors and then we can get right into it. So super excited to announce I'm now partnering with Baron of Dice to bring your TCG accessories to the next level. These deck boxes are put simply just eye-catching. I'm obsessed with the leather exterior on these. It just makes the art look super unique, and that's what you're looking for whenever you're trying to show off your deck. The playmats are also super high quality. They have a non-slip backing along with hand-stitched edges featuring that eye-popping art drawn by legendary artists in the space like Ron Spencer. They're also giving me a 5% discount code for all of you guys in the audience. Again, thank you Baron of Dice for sponsoring this channel. You guys can also click that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you do that. Additionally, you guys can get 10% off all of your Tolarian library proxies whenever you use code DT4D. Now, let's get on to kutzil. This is a 3 CMC creature. It's a legendary creature cat warrior that says your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. It also says whenever one or more creatures you control, each with power greater than their base power, deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. So the goal of this deck was to make sure we had a 1/1 counter on every single creature in the deck. Additionally, I did include a couple of Anthem effects because Anthems just give your entire board state +1/+1, and that gets rid of all the guesswork. Now we know that every single time our creature is dealing combat damage, we're going to get card advantage. Now I will say this is limited to 3 cards per turn, but drawing 3 cards per turn while you're dropping threat after threat after threat can overwhelm the board pretty quickly. I did also want to say the first ability is notable because it allows us to play a couple cards that are kind of risky but not with this strategy, like Hunter's Insight. This is a card that says you can choose a creature. Whenever that creature deals combat damage, you get to draw cards equal to the damage that creature dealt. Now historically, this is kind of a risky card because all someone has to do to blow you out is just remove that creature and you get 2 for 1. You lose your massive creature and you lost your card advantage piece. But since our commander is kutzil, our opponents aren't allowed to interact on our turn, meaning we can safely play cards like this and get the value. I've broken this list down into 5 different categories. We have our Anthem effects, our mass counters, our counter abilities, the cards that have abilities whenever you put counters on them, and then we have our ramp removal and card advantage. So let's get right into it. My favorite part of this deck tech was the abilities we got whenever we put counters on our creatures, so that's what we're going to talk about first. We have Abzan Falconer that gives each creature you control with a counter on it flying. It also has Outlast, so it can put a 1/1 counter on itself. Basking Brood-Scale says whenever it adapts or whenever a counter is put on it, you get to create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token that says sacrifice this creature, add 1 mana. Now we're ramping while we're making our Brood-Scale massive. This can go infinite, but I was not trying to include any infinite combos in this deck. Again, it's for lower powers. Champion of Liam says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put a 1/1 counter on her. And then creatures you control with power less than Champion of Liam can't block creatures you control. So now we make her massive and we can easily get in with our creatures. That way we can get the card advantage from kutzil. Evolutionary Witness says whenever a 1/1 counter is put on Evolutionary Witness, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. And then additionally it has adapt, so it can even put counters on itself. Hamza, Guardian of Arashan, is very powerful in this deck. It's a 6 CMC creature, but it says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. And then it says creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. So again, not only is this going to 9 times out of 10 be 2 mana to cast, it's also going to make it to where we're only paying the colored pips to cast our creature spells. This card is extremely powerful. Herd Baloth is another very powerful card in this deck. It's a 5 CMC creature beast that says whenever 1 or more counters are put on Herd Baloth, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. Pure Strain Gene Stealer enters the battlefield with 2 counters on it, and then it says whenever you attack, you may remove a counter from it. If you do, you get to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. What's really cool about this card is it enters with 2 counters on it, and it's also a 1/1. So even if we remove all the counters, we can put counters on this guy later and still start ramping. Rishkar is going to give the ability to all of our creatures that have counters on them to tap for a green mana. It also enters the battlefield and gets to put 2 counters on up to 2 creatures. Scavenging Ooze can help us with those nasty creature decks. It says we can pay 1 to exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, we get to put a 1/1 counter on Scavenging Ooze, and we get to gain 1 life. Sigarda Summons is one of those cards I put in as a whim, and it ended up being really busted. It says creatures you control with 1/1 counters on them have base power and toughness 4/4, and have flying and are angels in addition to their other types. Now this is 6 CMC, so it's just literal garbage in most decks, but whenever we're limited to cards under $1, this actually ends up being very strong, and it just overperformed and really made me happy. Turvagon is another card. This has Ravenous, which means if we cast it for over 5, we get to draw a card. It's 1x, 1 generic, and then 1 green. It has Trample, and whenever Turvagon deals combat damage to a player, you get to create that many 1/1 green Tyranid creature tokens. Viridian Joiner just taps for mana equal to the amount of power on it, so we just put a lot of counters on this guy and tap him for a ton of mana. Dusk Legion Duelist says whenever 1 or more counters are put on Dusk Legion Duelist, you get to draw a card. This only triggers once per turn, so solid card advantage. Now this next category is to ensure that every single creature has a counter on it, so it's our mass counter strategy. Kaiser says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you get to put a counter on it. Felidar Retreat says whenever a land enters the battlefield, you get to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control, and then those creatures gain vigilance. It can also create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, so it kind of does 2 things. It goes wide, and it can put counters on all of our creatures. Fight Rigging, it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you get to put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. Then if you control a creature with power 7 or greater, you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost, and then it does have Hideaway 5, so we get to look at the top 5, exile a card, and then cast it for free eventually. Forgotten Ancient says whenever a player casts a spell, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Forgotten Ancient, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of 1/1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. So again, the idea here is they cast 5 spells, we get 5 counters, maybe we have 5 creatures, now all of those creatures have at least 1 counter on them. Good Fortune Unicorn says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you get to put a 1/1 counter on it. Leonore Autumn Sovereign, this is a 4 CMC creature with Coven that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you get to draw a card. So not only are we getting card advantage, we're also getting to put a counter on a creature. Loyal Guardian has Lieutenant and says at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, you get to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. So mass counters, I love it. We have Luminarch Aspirant. This is a 2 CMC creature that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you get to put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. I did also want to mention the cards like Luminarch Aspirant, Leonore, Fight Rigging. The ones that trigger once per turn on combat are very impactful, especially whenever we're talking about our cards like Herd Baloth, right? Now, every single combat, we know we can trigger those abilities very consistently. Master Chef is a 3 CMC legendary enchantment background that gives your commander the ability that says this creature enters the battlefield with an additional counter on it, and other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional counter on them. Mikaeus the Lunarch, this has X and then 1 white to cast. Mikaeus the Lunarch enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it, and then you can tap it to put a 1/1 counter on Mikaeus, or you can tap it to remove a 1/1 counter from Mikaeus and put a 1/1 counter on each other creature we control. Again, very good here, especially with, again, those cards that put 1 counter on 1 creature. We can put 1 counter on Mikaeus and then remove that counter every single turn to ensure that we're buffing our board every single turn consistently. Oran Reef also does this. This is a 3 CMC creature ooze that says whenever Oran Reef enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control, and then whenever Oran Reef ooze attacks, you put a 1/1 counter on each attacking creature with a 1/1 counter on it. So again, just putting another counter every turn consistently. Ornery Tumblewag is just going to double the counters, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you get to put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. Whenever Ornery Tumblewag attacks, while saddled, double the number of counters on this creature, and then its saddle cost is 2. Requisition Raid is super flexible. This is a 1 CMC sorcery with Spree. We can either destroy target artifact for 1 additional, destroy target enchantment for 1 additional mana, or for 1 additional mana, we can put a 1/1 counter on each creature target player controls. That's always going to be us. Thundering Nightmare is a 5 CMC creature with Soulbound that says as long as Thundering Nightmare is paired with another creature, each of those creatures has, whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. This card is absolutely insane whenever we're talking about pairing it with Herd Baloth, because now it essentially says whenever opponent casts a spell, we get to generate a 4/4 creature, which gets insane very quickly. Wildwood Scourge is absolutely insane. It costs X and then 1 green. Wildwood Scourge enters the battlefield battlefield with X11 counters on it, and whenever one or more 1/1 counters are put on another non-Hydra creature you control, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Wildwood Scourge. You heard that right. So whenever we put one counter on our entire board state, let's say we have 5 creatures, 4 counters are going to get put on Wildwood Scourge. This guy gets massive insanely quickly. Finally, we have Anthems. That way we don't even have to worry about that counter madness once we have one of these on the battlefield. Skyhunter Strike Force is my favorite. It's a 3 CMC creature cat knight that has flying and melee, and as long as you control your commander, other creatures you control have melee. Melee is going to give them +1 for each player being attacked, and remember with kutzil, we do want to attack each player every single turn. So now all of our creatures get +3/+3 every single turn. Marshal's Anthem is a lot more flexible than I expected it to be. This is a 4 CMC enchantment that has multi-kicker. It says creatures you control get +1/+1, so it is that Anthem, and then it says when Marshal's Anthem enters the battlefield, return up to X target creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the number of times Marshal Anthem was kicked. So it's just a straight up reanimation spell that also gives our creatures an Anthem. It's perfect here. In the Trenches is another Anthem. It's 1 generic and 2 white. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Then you can pay 6 to exile target non-land permanent you don't control until the Trenches leaves the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery and only once. So for 6 mana, you get rid of one thing. Force of Virtue is almost always free. This is a 4 CMC enchantment that says if it's not your turn, you may exile a white card from your hand rather than play this spell, and then it has flash and the creatures you control get +1/+1. So it's just a free Anthem that you have to exile a spell for, but we don't even care about that. Gaia's Anthem's just your normal bread and butter, a 3 CMC enchantment that says creatures you control get +1/+1. King Dorian is another 3 CMC legendary creature human soldier that says other creatures you control get +1/+1. Then we can pay 5 to put a 1/1 counter on King Dorian and create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. We can also sacrifice King Dorian. Creature tokens you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So it kind of protects our board state a little bit while being an Anthem. I love it. Paladin class, also perfect for this deck. It costs 1 and it says spells your opponent casts during your turn cost 1 more to cast. Little bit of a non-bow, but it's okay. We can level it up for 3 and says creatures you control get +1/+1. And then it's level 5 can straight up kill a player. Whenever you attack until end of turn, target attacking creature gets +1/+1 for each other attacking creature and gains double strike. Put this on a flyer with a lot of counters on it, and then you're just hitting someone for a ton of damage.